legend of the Beatles breakup is still one that's discussed to a great extent today. There are a ton of reasons and mysteries surrounding what exactly caused it, and I'll certainly be discussing it in a later video, but let's take a flashback to 1969. This was the last year the Beatles as a group would be together, and after the turbulent White Album sessions, Paul McCartney went back to his drawing board and thought to himself about how he can recapture the group dynamic. When you think about it, the Beatles' greatest strength was their chemistry together, and playing live performances was what brought the four of them together in the first place. Not only did they have to stay in hotel rooms with one another, but they really bonded during the off times in these tours. So naturally, that was the answer that came to Paul. Bring back the live performances. So in January of 1969, that's exactly what they did. However, the difference in philosophy, the presence of Yoko Ono, and a bevy of business decisions still managed to bring back the friction that was present on the White Album. And for a short while, George Harrison had actually left the band. Long story short, that result was Let It Be, which I'll cover in depth in the next video, but just know that it was that album that truly marked the realization that the Beatles were on their last legs. Their last ever live performance on the rooftop was iconic because that was really the last time you'd ever see that Beatles chemistry shine again. So after those brutal sessions and a few months before the release of the Ballad and John and Yoko single, Paul McCartney decided to ring up George Martin and ask if he wanted to produce their next album, which would soon be entitled Abbey Road. George agreed, but only if they produced it like the way they used to, and after Paul agreed to that, the sessions were now underway. Now this Abbey Road session started in February of 1969, which were only 3 weeks after the disastrous Let It Be sessions. And to me, I think Paul knew from the start that he wouldn't be able to save the Beatles for very long, and he wanted to get out as much content as possible before the inevitable split up. There were a lot of singles releases throughout these sessions, such as the Ballad of John and Yoko I mentioned earlier, and even Get Back, which was a single release from the Let It Be sessions. It was a strategic move because the Beatles at this point were taking great lengths of time to produce albums, and most of the time they were even hiatuses during the sessions that lasted up to 8 weeks at times. Now as a result, I really don't consider the Abbey Road sessions to be one gradual process because there were various breaks taken, whether intentionally or not. Many times, all four members weren't even in the studio together. One famous story is actually with John Lennon, who got into a car accident in July of 1969, which ended up sidelining him out of the studio for a couple days. And as a result, he actually ended up missing out on George Harrison's famous composition Here Comes the Sun, as it was being recorded and mixed in the studio while he was out. Other breaks included the non-album single The Ballad of John and Yoko, where both Ringo and George weren't present, mainly due to commitments and holiday. It's really a case where the Beatles really weren't that interested anymore in the group dynamic, which really made the split up that I mentioned earlier inevitable. So after John Lennon got back from his car accident, you'd think that things would get back to normal, right? Well, the song the other three Beatles were working on that day he came back was Maxwell's Silver Hammer, and upon hearing it, John dismissed it as more of Paul Granny music, aka another Obla Di Obla Da, and he declined to participate in the recording. After another month of work on the album, which included the final Beatles photo shoot on August 22nd, 1969, Abbey Road was finally prepared and would be released on September 26th, 1969. However, something no Beatles fan would know at the time was that Lennon announced his departure from the group 6 days prior to the release of the album. So the Beatles were no longer a continuing group, as Lennon would venture onto his new band, simply entitled the Plastic Ono Band, and eventually his legendary solo career was underway. Now I'll talk more about the breakup of the Beatles in a future video, and with the vinyl of Abbey Road being rather straightforward with no extra things given, let's just head right into it and take a listen to the final album recorded by the Beatles, Abbey Road.
One thing I can tell you is you got to be free. Come together right now over me.
Well, that was quick. We already start at a Beatles classic, Come Together. This song has all the properties of a John Lennon song, from the extremely blues-styled guitar work to the more hidden lyrics. One of the lines, Here Come Old Flat Top, was actually a reference to Chuck Berry, and that actually ended up getting Lennon and the Beatles in trouble. That aside, what a song to start off the album with. Now, the first thing you'll notice with this song is that the bass work by Paul McCartney here is absolutely groovy. It almost covers the verses and iconic drumming by Ringo Starr in a blanket, and adds more of a badass feel to Lennon's voice. One of my all-time favorite bass licks is actually at the end of the solo, where Paul McCartney and George Harrison merged their parts together to create a really tense ending to the solo. The key ingredient to this song really is that groove though, and this one is a common favorite Beatles song from a lot of rock music lovers, because not only do Ringo Starr's drum fills in the verses create an amazing beat, but when you couple that with John Lennon's Shoot Me hook and Paul McCartney's heavy bass performance, this song ends up being incredibly catchy from the get-go. The vocal performance on this song is interesting because Paul actually overdubbed his harmony vocals later on, instead of doing them live in the studio with Lennon. Now this seems minor, but is actually significant later on as we head throughout this album. John's voice here is certainly bluesy and has the tone of some of his other blues tracks with the Beatles, such as Your Blues and even I'm So Tired. The lyrics are also pretty interesting because while John Lennon claims that he was trying to write a song for Timothy Leary, who was running against Ronald Reagan for governor at the time, there's a lot of references to John himself and his other bandmates. The lyrical highlight I put up could easily be interpreted as John's description of Paul McCartney, and throughout the song there are a ton of lines that are very clear allusions to George, Ringo, and himself. For example, Got to Be a Joker referencing Ringo's sense of humor, I Know You, You Know Me, One Thing I Can Tell You Is You Got to Be Free, referencing George's philosophical views, and Ono Sideboard and Waller Scumboot being obvious references to John himself. Now, this is just my interpretation obviously, but the lyrics here are really a ton of fun to look through and analyze. The group dynamic here though is certainly strong, and as I said earlier, the guitar work here is absolutely fantastic from everyone, and as a whole, this is one heck of a brilliant song. It's got a really fantastic tone to it, amazing rhythm with the bass performance, memorable drumming by Ringo Starr, and most importantly, it showcases all four Beatles at their best musically. That's something that was definitely missing on a few tracks in the White Album.
Something in the way she woos me. I don't want to leave her now. You know I believe in how.
Up next is a surprising love song by George Harrison with Something. George hasn't written a straightforward love song since If I Needed Someone from Rubber Soul, and while George claimed that this song was more oriented towards his love for God, you can still see the romantic theme throughout the song. Now I'll be honest, I'm not a fan of schmaltzy love songs, and with this song, it was very well created to be just that. However, the song does amp it up a notch several times throughout to still make it very much likable. One of my favorite moments actually comes during the bridge where Ringo Starr's drums suddenly amp up and the orchestration becomes more prominent.
You're asking me will my love grow? I don't know.
The song's lyrics are certainly really touching depending on how you look at them, and if you're someone really into love songs, I can't imagine any set of lyrics being as charming as these, and in that sense, guys like Frank Sinatra refer to this as the greatest of love songs. I mean, it's a great concept with this one, and I think George really nails it and does it justice vocally. I think that because George's voice is so calm and reserved, songs like this work even better as a result. The sad thing about this song for me though is that it's actually fallen for me on my favorites list. Now don't get me wrong, this is still an incredibly brilliant song from all angles, but melody-wise, this one does come up rather short when comparing it to other Beatles songs. I mean, the instrumental melody is certainly good, but vocally, it's certainly not as good melody-wise as some of George's other songs, such as While My Guitar Gently Weeps and If I Needed Someone, as I mentioned earlier. But all that being said, this is still a very classic song and one of the best Beatles songs out there. It's charming, very interesting with its structure, and still has all four Beatles playing together well musically. Many actually regard Something as the best Beatles song flat out, and I can certainly see why, because while this one doesn't appeal to me specifically in terms of its melody and whatnot, it's an incredibly well-crafted piece with some great guitar work throughout and powerful orchestration.
Bang, bang, Maxwell silver hammer came down upon her head. Bang, bang, Maxwell silver hammer made sure that she was dead.
After two legendary songs to start the album, we get Maxwell's Silver Hammer by Paul McCartney. Yes, it was this song that John refused to play on, and While I don't exactly agree with John that it's more of his granny music, it doesn't really sound very Beatles-like, or even Paul-like for that matter. To start things off, the lyrics are probably among the darkest Beatles lyrics, especially for Paul, which tell a story about a guy murdering people with a hammer. Not exactly sure why Paul of all people would write a song like that, but hey, even he can step out of his boundaries and pull it off. But when you think about it, the arrangement here really is quite clever as a result. The Moog synthesizer perfectly captures the rather downbeat and dark tone to this one, for starters, and it's probably the strongest melody in the song. Paul's vocals are actually pretty eerily relaxed in this one, and aside from some nice typical Paul vocal hooks once in a while, it's a pretty casual performance from him that I'd actually compare to the bridge that he sang in A Day in the Life. As a result of all this I mentioned, this song really isn't ranked highly amongst most Beatles fans, and whenever one mentions this album in general, you'll most likely hear that this track is usually known as the weakest song on the album. In my opinion, it's not too impressive compared to the first two, but quality-wise, it's still a pretty good song. I mean, for starters, I think the change in tone works for the better here, because it definitely distinguishes this song from the others as a result. The harmonies are also not too shabby either, and the lyrics are pretty creative for a Paul McCartney tune. It's definitely a massive step down in quality from the first two tracks, as I mentioned, but when you listen to this one, there's nothing exactly wrong with it that ruins it for me. With a better melody and probably some more creative input into this one, it would definitely be a lot more great, but as it stands, I still view this track as good.
Oh, darling, please believe me. I'll never do you no harm.
Following that one is another Paul McCartney track, Oh Darling. When Paul rang up George Martin and said that they were going to make another album like they used to, this song is probably what Paul was thinking of, because this is very much in the category of I'm Down and Long Tall Sally. Considering the large time gap between those two tracks and this one, it actually ended up being rather difficult for Paul to pull this one off, according to him. While he did get Helter Skelter on the White Album, this song is more along the lines of pure rock and roll rather than metal, and thus it took Paul a bit longer to readjust to that time frame again. Considering that this was a pure rock and roll song, the lyrics are relatively standard fare, albeit they are definitely better than Why Don't We Do It in the Road. For me, the refrains to this one are what really convinced me that this was actually a good song. Not only does Paul's voice really stand out there, but the guitar work and piano playing kind of work together, and in regards to the piano, we get some really high keys near the end that I really enjoy alongside Paul's climbing voice.
When you told me you didn't need me anymore, well, you know I need to go down and die.
Now while this one isn't as good as the opening two tracks, I think this is a good tune on this album. It has its place as the rock and roll number that the Beatles have returned to since the White Album, and to me, it works effectively here.
Garden with me, I'd like to be under the sea in an octopus's garden in the shade.
Our next song is Octopus's Garden, which is the second and last Ringo Starr song to ever be recorded by the Beatles. If you're still a bit struck by the tone of Maxwell's Silver Hammer, this one will definitely bring you back to the happy grounds that the Beatles are accustomed to, because this is really a happy record. Ringo Starr's heartwarming tone from Good Night is back in full force here, and when you combine it with the words he's singing, which seem to be like a happy fantasy in a way, then this song really does a sensational job with really creating the happy and warm atmosphere. We haven't actually gotten a lot of great guitar licks since Come Together, but we get another really fantastic one here that opens the track on a great note. And when we get to the chorus, the piano playing really amps up alongside the great melody we get here.
We would be so happy, you and me. No one there to tell us what to do.
George Harrison played a large role in assisting Ringo Starr with the creation of this song, and you can kinda tell due to the presence of all these great guitar parts throughout, but it still really impresses me honestly. Eventually, we get to the solo, which contain a lot of strange effects, such as the bubbling sounds and the distorted vocals, before ending on a really nice high note at the end. Now, while some can laugh at this song for being rather cheesy, I think that it's really a solid composition for Ringo, and kind of captures the happiness of this album that Paul and Ringo did claim was present. As a whole, quality-wise, this one is certainly good. And it definitely is the best out of the last 3 tracks.
She's so
Concluding side 1 is the first John Lennon composition since the opener with I Want You, She's So Heavy. While the last 5 songs have more or less been standard rock songs in structure, this one is probably the most complex song, structure-wise, on this album, and definitely in terms of length alone, with the runtime of this song being over 7.5 minutes. This does make it the second longest Beatles song I've covered, just under Revolution 9 from the White Album. Unlike that song though, this one is definitely comprehensible at the very least, so let's get to it. Now for starters, the lyrics of this one are as simple as it gets for any Beatles song. There are only a total of 13 distinct words in this song, and if he solely went off the lyrics, this one would be rather abysmal. Lennon addressed this song's simplistic structure by saying, when it gets down to it, you don't say, I would be incredibly pleased if someone would have the foresight to notice me drowning and come and help me. You just scream. Now, while technically true, you could definitely do a better job than 13 distinct words on this one. However, that being said, the lack of lyrical quality really doesn't hurt this song because the instrumentation in this song to me is easily the best on this side so far, along with Come Together. The guitar arpeggio we get here is absolutely phenomenal, and coupled with the Moog synth melody as well as that epic wind sound effect we get in the 3-minute long fade out, the instrumentation in this one will always leave you coming back to this one. What also warrants you coming back is that absolutely phenomenal vocal performance from John. He actually showcases his vocal range in this song, from his lower range Driving Me Mad line in the verses to his belted out scream right before the 3-minute long fade out. I also really love both of the choruses where he harmonizes with himself on the word heavy, especially that second chorus. Just what an incredible vocal display by Lennon on this one. Now, I obviously have to mention that 3-minute long fade out itself because some actually get turned off by it. However, I think that this track actually gets more and more epic because of it, due to the wind sound effect I mentioned earlier that gets louder and louder before the song suddenly comes to a quick stop, which was intentional as John told Jeff Emmerich to just stop the tape at that part. When it all comes down to it, this is probably my second favorite song on the album and easily my favorite song of side 1. It's one of the Beatles' heaviest tracks, again showcases their instrumentation talents, and shows that even without great lyrics, a song can still turn out amazing. And this one is just that, amazing.
It's been here. Here comes the sun. Here comes the sun. I say it's alright.
After the dark and epic ending of side 1, we open with Here Comes the Sun by George Harrison. Imagine listening to this album on vinyl and after getting through the last track, turning the record over, starting side 2, and then hearing this really happy guitar arpeggio. Speaking of which, how many guitar arpeggios have we had on this album so far? Seems to be a theme alert for what's to come. Anyways, this is probably one of the most recognizable Beatles songs, and for good reason. It's one of the happiest and most cheery songs I've ever heard. I've looked at a few tabs of this one and there isn't a single minor chord in this song, which is quite fitting. The song's inception was actually after George went outside and away from the Apple offices, which at this point was a completely stressful environment. What makes this song so cheery though? You can point to George's vocals again being very reserved and bright, or you can point to those really happy lyrics, but to me, the instrumentation really makes this song so special. The guitar work by George Harrison here is easily his most iconic performance, and when you combine that with the hand claps, you can just picture the rays of sunshine that George is sending down with this one, that really give this one a unifying and optimistic sound.
Darling, I feel that I see it slowly melting. Little darling, it seems like years since it's been clear.
This song really brightens people's day, no pun intended. It's amazing that a song by George Harrison, not even released as a single, ends up as something universally recognized, but with this album selling over 30 million units, I mean, people really recognize this one as one of his strongest compositions, and I agree because this song is absolutely phenomenal. It's happy, it's amazing rhythmically, and it's close to impossible not to smile as you hear this. Between this one and Something, George's performance on this album so far has really been incredible.
'Cause the world is round, it turns me on.
Next up is another Lennon composition, Because. It has a very similar arpeggio to I Want You, She's So Heavy, but the two songs couldn't be further apart, tone-wise. While the instrumentation alone made Here Comes the Sun so great, the vocal performance in this song from John, Paul, and George is easily the greatest part of this song. I mean, we've seen some legendary harmonies from songs like This Boy and Here, There, and Everywhere, but this song is constructed as one giant harmony. When you match that with the lyrics here, which are really reflective of the Beatles philosophy, you get one amazing song that really shines in all three categories. Even instrumentally, George Martin really does this song justice via that electric harpsichord, and the synthesizer solo at the end alongside those really outstanding harmonies just adds to this one's beauty. The strange tone to this one leads many to call this psychedelic, and I agree personally because this one has the makings of the psychedelic era Beatles any way you look at it. It's also the first time on this album that George, Paul, and John sing harmonies on a track, and man do they really nail it. If you want a Beatles song that's absolutely breathtaking, I don't think you can do better than this one. It's easily good.
You never give me your money. You only give me your funny paper. And in the middle of negotiations, you break down.
And now we get to the main event, the Abbey Road medley. We started off with the Paul McCartney composition, You Never Give Me Your Money. The opening piano chords of this song are probably the most spine-chilling opening chords to any Beatles song, because if you're a die-hard Beatles fan, you know what's to come. After the opening sequence, Ringo's drums kicking in, and we get the rock section of the song, which is pretty much my favorite section of not only this song, but the album.
Out of college, money spent, see no future, pay no rent, all the money's gone, nowhere to go.
Paul's vocals become amazing as he belts out some really great lines, including the One Sweet Dream, which is probably one of my favorite lines he's ever sung. And we also get one of John Lennon's best guitar solos that takes the song up 1,000 notches.
One sweet dream. Pick up the bags, get in the limousine.
It's not as much of a technical solo as it is a mood-enhancing solo, and near the end, Lennon just continues to pour away at it. In fact, everyone in this track really shines one way or another, and it may just be the personal element to this one that causes it. This song lyrically alludes to the Beatles' management issues, with Paul McCartney expressing discontent with John, George, and Ringo choosing the Stones manager, Alan Klein, as the Apple manager rather than Paul's choice, which was his wife Linda's father. Near the end, though, we get some fantastic lines from Paul that allude to a more nostalgic look at the Beatles' career. So in a sense, Paul kinda goes Penny Lane on this song from a lyrical aspect, and because of that, I think this is really one of his best lyrical compositions. It's also honestly my favorite song on this album because this one really demonstrates the musicianship of all four members. Ringo setting the stage for the latter half of the song, George and John carrying that rhythm, and Paul with his great vocal performance and piano playing leading the charge. It's definitely good. And a really incredible start to the medley. Following suit from that is Sun King, which is a John Lennon composition. Yup, John Lennon is also contributing to this medley, and we get another song demonstrating just how brilliant the Beatles' harmonies are. Although in this song they are rather monotonous compared to Because. Still though, the sound is just incredible, and the entire atmosphere to this one is really laid back and soft, with some really solid bass playing from Paul McCartney and a few nice guitar licks from George doing the trick. This one's placement also makes sense, being right after the upbeat and energetic You Never Give Me Your Money, and definitely cools you off after that incredibly powerful track. Now, if this were a standalone song, I definitely wouldn't think too highly of it, because while the song is roughly 2.5 minutes, the actual harmonies and melody to this one don't actually kick in until 30 seconds in. And the speed to this one definitely makes this the slowest paced song on the album. If you can get past that though and follow the groove that the medley takes you on, you'll find the song doing a great job of calming things down and really fitting in that peaceful environment. I'd say this one is good as a result. And again, it benefits from being placed right after the last track, but even if you listen to this one alone, it's still a really mellow and simple track to get along to. The last thing to point out are the lyrics I listed in the highlights.
Quando para mucho mi amore de felice corazón.
Half of that is apparently gibberish, but for any native people watching, you might be chuckling at a few of those lines just from the pure strangeness of it.
Me and Mr. sleeps in the park, shapes in the dark, trying to save paper.
The last track segues right into this one with Me and Mr. Mustard, which is another Lennon track. Now this song is actually from when the Beatles went to India, so this song was a year old before finally seeing the light of day. Just as a heads up, Lennon was really dismissive of these Abbey Road medley tracks he contributed, referring to all of them as a piece of garbage. And similar to the last track, this one isn't nearly as enjoyable without listening to the first 2 tracks of this medley. In fact, the song actually picks up speed and tempo from Sun King and really showcases the chemistry between Ringo and Paul. Paul's pretty much been on his A game throughout the album, and this song is no different, as he really creates a fantastic groove on his bass.
Keeps a 10-mark note up his nose. Such a mean old man.
Not only does the song have a better melody than the last one, but it's way easier to get into, and because of the groove to it, it really ends up being a pleasant experience. As for who Me and Mr. Mustard is, it's apparently about a Meister that Lennon read about in India. And as I said, it's a song that dates back to that time period, but regardless, this one is certainly good.
Well, you should see it in black, dressed in a polythene black. Yes, you should see Polythene Pam. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Next we get to my favorite of the 3 Lennon tracks on this medley with Polythene Pam. The second you hear that powerful acoustic chord sequence, you know that you're about to hear something special. Out of the 3 tracks Lennon dismissed as crap, I don't understand his issues with this one. I mean, lyrically, it's the most clever song out of the 3, and Lennon sings this song as perfectly as he could have, adding a bit of a Scouse accent to it.
And a dose of it and jackals and kills. She's killing Dilla when she's at the hills.
Some of the lines go by so fast that you hardly even remember them on the first hearing, but once you listen to this one a few times, I think it really ends up making the strongest impact. The highlight here is definitely the musicianship, which has really been exceptional throughout this album so far. After that amazing guitar sequence I mentioned earlier, Ringo just churns out the rest of this track on his drums, while Lennon goes Pinball Wizard-esque on us with his acoustic guitar playing. What's super cool though is that guitar solo at the end, which sounds absolutely spectacular, and you'll see why it's cool pretty shortly. In short, this one is simply amazing. It might only be over a minute, but don't be fooled. This one is the only track apart from You Never Give Me Your Money so far, which I can say can be enjoyed on its own.
She came in through the bathroom window, protected by a silver spoon.
Right as the solo from the last song begins, it continues in the opening to this one before Ringo smashes his cymbals and Paul grabs the mic and starts our next track, She Came In Through the Bathroom Window, which was actually written by Paul about fans who would break into his house. Rather charming concept, I guess. Remember when I said that the guitar solo from Polythene Pam is cool? The reason is because the exact same guitar part appears in this song, and because it sounds so goddamn amazing, this one really becomes breathless. As far as guitar performances go, I think George Harrison has a shining moment on this song. The guitar parts work in a call and response sort of way with Paul's vocals, which are very smooth and delicate. In fact, the instrumentation in this song really works around Paul's voice, and we hear a lot of sounds oriented around specific lines Paul sings. For example, that whip sound we hear is an actual whip Ringo uses after Paul sings "She works at 15 clubs a day," maybe referencing prostitution perhaps.
She worked at 15 clubs a day.
I mean, I can go on and on about the greatness of the vocals and sound here, but that guitar performance for me is really what sets this one apart from the other tracks. I couldn't imagine them topping Polythene Pam's energetic guitar performance, but here, they do it to perfection. This is yet another amazing song, and actually the only song of the two in the medley that ends naturally.
Old and slumbers fill your eyes. Smiles awake you when you rise.
We're close to the end as we have Golden Slumbers by Paul here. The rest of the medley is going to be all Paul material, and this one pretty much showcases why Paul is one of the greatest singers ever. The amount of emotion he puts into this one is quite stunning, and it almost sounds gospel in a sort of sense because of the passion he's putting. The instrumentation is more pop-oriented with a simple piano melody that's helped by George Martin's orchestration. The lyrics to this one are actually somewhat nicked by a very old poem by Thomas Dekker entitled Cradle Song, but with the impending end of the Beatles, I think it's rather fitting here. With the orchestra really carrying the mood and Paul adding even more passion and emotion to it, this is probably the best vocal performance on the album, and as such, a great song. This is where the medley actually becomes pretty emotional, and it's insane how much of a shift of tone there is from the first 5 songs. But hey, it works to perfection.
You're gonna carry that weight, for a long time.
Now we're starting to reach anthemic proportions with the following song, Carry That Weight. If the last song didn't give any indication that the Beatles were coming to an end, this one certainly does. This song features all 4 Beatles harmonizing with each other, which is only one of 2 Beatles songs ever to do this. It's quite fitting considering that the subject matter of the lyrics are about all 4 Beatles having to carry the weight of their past into the future. It's again some really amazing lyrics from Paul McCartney, and while over the series I've definitely been a bit critical of his lyrics on past albums, there's no doubt that he's become the best songwriter on this album from a word standpoint. So how do you top all 4 Beatles harmonizing? How about the George Martin Orchestra playing the refrain of You Never Give Me Your Money? It's an absolutely brilliant callback to that song, and we even get another verse in the style of that song, which seemed to hint at a feeling of loneliness.
I only send you my invitations, and in the middle of the celebrations, I break down.
It's probably one of the most emotional sequences on this album, to be honest, and with all 4 Beatles harmonizing with each other till the end, this is another song that just showcases the collectiveness to the group. It's easily a good song. And similar to You Never Give Me Your Money, Polythene Pam, and She Came In Through the Bathroom Window, this one can certainly be enjoyed without the other songs.
Oh yeah! Alright! Are you gonna be in my dreams tonight?
And to conclude the medley, we get The End. This is one of the most unique songs on not only this album, but in the entire Beatles discography, because we get an instance of all 4 bandmates doing a solo. A song like this no doubt indicates that all 4 Beatles just knew that this was the last album, because you'll never see Ringo Starr of all drummers be willing to play a drum solo. However, in this case, he does play one, and it's really a marvelous solo to start us off before Paul, John, and George go ballistic and trade solos for several bars. Now, the first 2 bars are played by McCartney, who seems to mimic his sharp guitar work from songs like Another Girl, Taxman, and Good Morning, Good Morning. George Harrison's style is pretty melodic if you listen to it closely, and no doubt he would feature it in his future solo songs like My Sweet Lord. With John, he goes to his rhythmic bag of tricks and goes revolution on us with some really heavy distortion. After a few trade-offs, we finally get the ending with some piano work. First time I heard this, I had no idea what was going on, but then Paul McCartney quickly changes that with this incredibly famous line, "And in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make."
And in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make.
And then I realized how heartfelt the whole experience was. I mean, I think every Beatles fan gets goosebumps down their neck every time they hear that line. And I don't blame them because it's quite chilling and very cosmic, as John would put it. This song, structure-wise, is not only highly unique, but it's the true definition of musical craftsmanship, with all 4 Beatle members showcasing how good they are on their instruments. It's certainly a good song, and one hell of a goodbye for any band I've ever heard in terms of really displaying each member's importance.
Majesty's a pretty nice girl. Someday I'm gonna make her mine. Oh yeah, someday I'm gonna make her mine.
So in true Beatles fashion, we don't end on a sad note, but actually end with Her Majesty. This track is hardly a legitimate song, being just over 20 seconds long, and the only thing to really talk about here is why they even decided to even add this after the last track. The obvious answer is because the Beatles never took themselves seriously, and as a result, a song like this being at the end is the only possible perfect ending. Another answer, which requires some background knowledge, is that they simply didn't know where to put it, so they left it at the end. Remember how Mean Mr. Mustard transitions into Polythene Pam? Well, the original intention was to actually have Mean Mr. Mustard end in D major, and then have it transition to Her Majesty, which does tie in with the line in Mean Mr. Mustard about seeing the Queen. However, they had issues with it, and they scrapped it before the final mixing session, which saw the song appear after the end, which finally Paul then just said, leave it like that. So as a whole, this is a very short song for me, and it overall translates to an okay experience. It's not a song I think people feel strongly about anyways, because, I mean, it's just really quick and it just flies by. As an ending though, I gotta give credit to them because it does summarize the fun of the Beatles.
They didn't even give us a chance, Christ, you know it ain't easy. You know how hard it can be. The way things are going, they're gonna crucify me.
We aren't done yet, as we have to talk about the Ballad of John and Yoko, which, as you guessed, is a John Lennon song. The entire Abbey Road album really lacked the Lennon-McCartney connection of years past, and this might just be the last time Lennon-McCartney worked together to make the song work. George and Ringo were tied to commitments and holidays, as I mentioned earlier in the video, so they didn't actually appear in the studio and on this track. Rather than wait for them to get back, John wanted to release the song as soon as possible, and so with Paul in town, he got him and then they went at it. This song was actually a #1 hit in the UK for the Beatles, and their last UK #1 at that. And honestly, I'm surprised because when you compare the song to other Beatles singles, it's not particularly as good as the others. Now that being said, the song is definitely still a pleasure to listen to, and Lennon-McCartney's musicianship here guarantees that it still works to perfection. But the melody here isn't too strong. In fact, if it weren't for the slide guitar, I'd be lying if I said I didn't quite remember most of the melody to this one the first time I heard it. That being said, the lyrics here are still a blast, with Lennon making a reference to his not as popular as Jesus controversy, and for what it's worth, it's pretty charming at times. Even some parts, such as that stop time in the middle, make this one quite enjoyable. Now, it's not a song that most Beatles fans would choose as their favorite or anything, but there isn't much fault to this one when you think about it, so as a whole, this is a good song. And the B-side is a George Harrison track, Old Brown Shoe. While the last song wasn't really a personal favorite by many, this song is actually quite loved by many Beatles fans. I mean, the first time I heard it, I admit, I wasn't too impressed, but the more I listened to it, the more I realized that it's actually really enjoyable. In fact, I'd say that this is the most rock and roll and blues song George ever wrote as a Beatles. The guitar work is very bluesy and distorted. The piano work is definitely something you'd hear as accompaniment in a blues song, and even George's vocals here are just really fun and lighthearted. In terms of what this song is about, it's apparently about the duality of things, but I'd be lying if I told you that I knew that from the get-go. It's quite poetic actually for George Harrison, and this is probably his best song lyrically I've talked about in this video. You could actually just consider it his response to McCartney's Hello Goodbye. It's not quite as lovable as that one, or even Something or Here Comes the Sun overall, but lyrically, I think George was really in his element here. So as a whole, this song is certainly good. I can't still say that I'm as in love with this song as some other Beatles fans are, but I certainly agree that it deserves a lot more praise than it gets. And that is every track on Abbey Road plus the Ballad of John and Yoko single reviewed. This was definitely another instant classic Beatles album, and I think before I started this video, you all knew that. I mean, let's get into the meat of things and check out the album scoreboard. If it weren't for Her Majesty, we'd have a perfect album for only the third time this series. That being said, this was probably the most consistent album quality-wise since Revolver. The gap of quality between all the good tracks isn't that widespread because I think the Beatles wanted to simplify their experimental phrase, kinda like what they were trying to do with the White Album, and just flat out produce a good Beatles album. Aside from Maxwell's Silver Hammer, there wasn't really a song on this album that was completely out of style for them. Sure, there was stuff like Her Majesty and I Want You, She's So Heavy, but that were pushing it one way or another. But when you mostly boil it down, this one is the most rock-centered album the Beatles have ever made. As a result, it's one of the best-selling albums of all time, because with this album, you know exactly what you are getting. Now for the main event though. Where do I rank this album on the greatest Beatles album list? Well, let us unveil it, and as you can see, it places third. And this was actually the hardest album for me to rank, because I feel that it could have easily been anywhere from 1st to 5th, but third for me is very fitting. It only has one okay song total after all, which nearly didn't make the album itself, and I feel that there's a lot of highlights on the album that warrant it over the White Album. I feel though that cohesively, Revolver and Sgt. Pepper are just a tad bit better. I mean, just as a whole, Revolver has my favorite song of all time on it, and Sgt. Pepper has the best Beatles song of all time so far on it. So, I think it makes sense where this one is ranked. At this point though, ranking the top 5 Beatles albums is very difficult, so if you guys have a different list, let me know in the comments because I'm sure it'll look much different than mine. With all that said and done, here are the final song rankings I'm gonna do. I'm gonna keep Let It Be's song rankings as a secret, and probably make a journal of it so you can hear my final thoughts on all of the songs. For now though, here's where most of Abbey Road stuff rank, and as you can see, most of the songs are in a patch on this list, which shows how consistent this album was. Very much like how Revolver was very consistent. The best song, as you can tell, was Here Comes the Sun, which joins You Never Give Me Your Money and Come Together in the top 20. The top 20 is super stacked at this point. In fact, just tell me any band who's written that versatile of a top 20. You could maybe say a group like Queen or Pink Floyd, but there is not many bands who can really claim a versatile list like that. Anyways, with the lists out of the way, let's get into the 3 observations I made about Abbey Road. First off is the lack of Lennon-McCartney collaborations on this album. While you can argue that the Abbey Road medley collectively was Lennon-McCartney, this was another instance of an album that was really dominated by Paul throughout. He wrote the most songs for starters, but he was also the only Beatle in these sessions that was really dedicated to recording. There were breaks taken as I mentioned early in this video, but none of those were because of Paul. And I think there's no doubt that Paul himself realized that Abbey Road would be it after he took a look at how the recording sessions for this album ultimately turned out. Aside from that though, Lennon-McCartney's songs in this album were radically different stylistically. Come Together and You Never Give Me Your Money were somewhat similar, but songs like I Want You, She's So Heavy and Because were certainly different than songs like Maxwell's Silver Hammer and Oh Darling. The stylistic differences really strained the Lennon-McCartney partnership on this album, and that can honestly be attributed for a reason for the band's breakup. The second observation I noticed was just the uniqueness of the Abbey Road medley. This 16-minute collage, I feel, could not have done a better job of illustrating the Beatles' career in a nutshell. The instrumentation was sensational throughout, the harmonies were really gorgeous from all 4 Beatles at times, and the lyrics were really quite poignant in several of the songs. Now, John Lennon was critical of this album and so forth, but I don't think any of the Beatles realized the extent of the brilliance they showcased during this medley. Personally, what makes this album so re-listenable is the way it progresses from beginning to end, and with this medley being at the very end, it almost feels like the perfect goodbye from a band that's influenced so many out there. The last observation is that this album is the last Beatles album released while the group were still simultaneously together. There is one last album to discuss, but that was released after both John and Paul had left the band. In fact, this album's release actually coincided with John Lennon's decision to leave the group privately, and he only kept it privately because of the future releases the Beatles had in store. Because of this though, many Beatles fans actually regard Abbey Road as the last Beatles album, period. But I'm one of those who still say that Let It Be is actually the last one, and I'll definitely explain more on that in my review of that album. In the end though, this album is a real heartbreaker to listen to, knowing that the band that had revolutionized popular music throughout the decade had now split up. Back then, it was really seen as a disastrous event, and many Beatles fans drenched themselves in sorrow for the following couple years. There is one more album to talk about officially, and that's what we'll do next time when I take a look at both the film and the album, Let It Be.